Good day everyone, welcome to this video lecture. We'll talk about the review of related literature. In this lecture, we'll talk about literature review both as an act that you do as a researcher across the research process, and also we'll talk about it as a section in the research manuscript, whether it's the proposal of the study or the full final thesis, dissertation, or journal article. So we'll be discussing the following topics. We'll talk about the purposes of doing literature review across the research process. We'll talk about the different sources of literature, and we'll try to see and evaluate which literature should be prioritized to be put in the literature review section and in the other parts of the study. And then we'll talk about the steps in conducting literature review, and we'll talk about how to write the literature review. So, what are the purposes of literature review? So, as explained in the last video, the literature review is one of the bases for you to be able to identify a research problem. So, because of the many research that have been done before, they have also probably put forward a lot of recommendations in relation to how to move knowledge forward, and you can be inspired by these recommendations, etc. Next is orientation to what is known and what is not yet known. So it's very important that when you do research, you have to know first, in the phenomenon that you are trying to look into, whether that's quantitative or qualitative, you should know all of the things or the knowledge that has been already studied in that specific area, and also to be able to know what is not yet known or what knowledge still has a deficit in that area of study. Next, it helps you determine gaps or inconsistencies in the body of research. So this is connected to the second purpose, because you need to know all the things that are known in relation to the studies that you want to look into, or the phenomenon that you want to look into. You will be able to also find out, if you are doing literature review comprehensively and exhaustively, you'll be able to find out which areas of the phenomenon have not yet been given focus, or what findings seem to be inconsistent, meaning the truth regarding that relationship that you're testing or you want to test has not yet been fully established because there are inconsistent findings based on the literature. And we call the things that are not yet known or are not yet focused or not yet thoroughly studied or not yet established in the literature as research gaps. And this is very important, and this will be one of the key indicators of how your literature review will be evaluated, whether or not you have scanned the literature comprehensively and exhaustively and you were able to identify all the themes that are emerging from the literature review as you critically appraise it and critically explore it, and also be able to identify the gaps in knowledge and also situate your current study where the gap is found, and to be able to contribute to the growing body of knowledge in the field of study that you're trying to get into. Next is, there might be a determination of a need to replicate a study. Probably there's a study that has been done in another country, and you want to know whether or not the difference in social context in your country, might also mirror or differentiate the way the variables would relate to each other in your country. So it might be something that you want to do, or probably there's a study that has been published and they identified a lot of limitations and restrictions in the way they did their study. So probably you may want to improve on that study and address all the limitations, address all the restrictions that they have identified in the study, and be able to do your own study in relation to that. Also, if you're doing an experimental research, the literature review can also be the source of information on the interventions that you want to do. Some of you have looked into doing studies that might be done in an experimental way. Like, for example, you want to see whether or not a specific type of coaching is effective on the athletic performance of student athletes. Then the intervention on how coaching should be done, or how coaches should be taught in relation to how they should train the athletes, can be inspired by or can be taken from available literature. So here are other purposes of the literature review. Also, when you make your proposal, you will have to identify or be able to create a conceptual framework, and probably also base that conceptual framework with a theoretical framework. And the basis for that will be found in the literature review. Next, when you do your proposal, you will also have to identify the correct methods and the correct research design that you have to use in order for you to be able to engage in your study. And you'll be able to find the suitable designs and data collection methods in the literature. No, it will not be found in your literature review section. Definitely, it will be found in the methodology. But there are certain methodological practices that needs to be cited, and therefore you should have a literature source for it. Another advantage of doing literature review is that you'll also be able to identify experts who could be used as consultants on a project. They could also be reviewers on the project. Or if you need a scale or an instrument or a standardized survey form and there's nothing available in the internet, you may want to correspond with the author of a specific study and email them about that survey form. And if they're kind enough, they'll be lending the survey form to you. If it's for free, if it's not for sale. So those are some of the perks or advantages of really thoroughly looking at the literature. You're not just looking at the content of the literature, but you're also looking at the who's writing this literature, and can these experts be tapped later if you have questions regarding the research. So this is not really in terms of writing the literature review section or the RRL section. RRL means review of related literature. So it's not really in the RRL section that this will be an advantage, but this is in terms of you conducting the research in a more valid and reliable way by asking for comments and suggestions from experts if needed, of course. And then, of course, we have assistance in interpreting findings and developing implications. So you might think that you will only do related literature review in the proposal part of the study. And after you've collected the data and you have analyzed the data, you don't need to collect literature anymore. But in reality, after you have collected and analyzed the data, you have to go back and look at the literature and see whether or not your findings are related to, are comparable to, do your findings confirm the findings of the previous literature. Because again, that's the reason why we are looking for the gap in the first part of the proposal, because we want to see the things that are not yet known, or the ideas that are still inconsistent in terms of findings in the previous literature. And now that we are in part of that conversation while you are doing the literature, you will now present your findings and analyze your findings, and now represent the literature where that basically converses with the findings of your study, whether or not they confirm your findings or they are inconsistent with your findings, just to see whether or not your findings continue the growing body of knowledge through situating your study in the given literature. So in quantitative studies, literature review is important in the proposal because it includes a substantial amount of literature in the beginning to provide direction for the research questions or hypotheses. Now, I did tell you that you can already create hypotheses, you can already identify problems, from the get-go of doing the research. But you have to refine those problems better you will have to refine and identify the correct variables, and you will only do that, no? You will only be able to do that if you have already immersed yourselves in the literature. And it is only when you have immersed yourselves in the literature will you be able to find the correct variables that you need to correlate with the main phenomenon that you want to explore in your specific study. So in literature reviews, in quantitative studies, the expectation is you really have to do a very comprehensive and a very exhaustive search for different research literature in order for you to really see whether or not the phenomenon and the relationships that you're trying to test is a gap in knowledge, no? Because if it's no longer a gap in knowledge, then probably you might look into testing other types of relationships, or probably testing other types of variables for you to be able to contribute to the knowledge, because you cannot contribute to the knowledge if you are just repeating and repeating what is already said. You only replicate a study when the findings are still not very conclusive, when the truth is not yet that's completely established. But if it's already established, there's no point of engaging in the same studies over and over again. And that's the reason why you're doing the literature review, because you want to see the studies that are needed but are not yet completely done, or completely that are not yet fully established in terms of the facts. So those are that. So you in your research journey, no, in the beginning you may have already developed, that's why we call it an initial conceptual framework. In the previous video we call it an initial conceptual framework because we're not yet sure what the literature review is telling us. Are testing the relationships within these variables really founded, do we really do it that way, or can we look for other variables based on what the literature is telling us? So nothing is final in terms of the research problems, the hypothesis being tested, and the conceptual framework up until you have really immersed yourself in the literature. So that will be able to help us, identify the right questions to ask and the right hypothesis to state. Now, you will also do literature review, the act of exploring the literature in the final paper. At the end of the study, the researcher then revisits the literature and makes a comparison between your current results in the study. So probably when you're doing your thesis, you'll be collecting the data, and after collecting the data, you will analyze it. And as I explained earlier, you have to compare it with the existing findings in the literature. So you begin your research journey with refining your problem through the literature review, and you will end your study by looking at your findings and how they compare with and how they support or contradict the current literature. So please don't think that the literature review is only limited to the review of related literature section of the paper, because it's not. No, you will have to do a lot of literature review, the act of searching and reading and analyzing and critically appraising research throughout the research process, right? So there will be a lot of reading, and you probably already know that because you're getting into a research class. Now, at least for the BSD framework or BSD the BSD format, this is how we outline our section in a quantitative study. So first, you just don't do a related review, a review of related review or RRL section as just one continuous discussion. No, first you have to divide the related review of literature using themes. You have to thematically present them. So you have to subdivide them using themes, so that the reader will be able to appreciate and be guided with the storytelling that is found in the literature review. Now, at least in the BSD tradition, you have to divide the RRL section based on the main phenomenon and the main variables in your study. So usually you start with the main phenomenon, so that's going to be the first part of your literature review. And then after that, whatever the factors that are found that points towards that main phenomenon will be treated next, or will be included next, and then the outcome variables will be the last. And then within those literature review sections, you have to, one, define and conceptualize the variable in question, and number two, you have to look at the relationships of the variables in relation to the other variables of the study. Okay, so let's give this conceptual framework an example. So for example, this is the study I'm looking at the relationship of school engagement of student athletes with its antecedents, which are social demographic characteristics and attitudes towards school engagement, and then looking at its a relationship with an outcome variable, which is your psychological well-being. So the argument here is that school engagement among school athletes is very important, and the extent to which they engage in school activities is through their social demographic characteristics like age, gender, household characteristics, etc. And also, it is influenced by their overall attitudes about school engagement. Do they have positive or negative sentiments over probably extracurricular activities, etc.? And also, we are arguing in this study that school engagement of school athletes will improve their psychological well-being. So that is basically the main arguments of this hypothetical study. So, if we are going to do the review of related literature section, what and how would we arrange the theme? So as I explained, the first theme should be the main phenomenon of the study. So in this study, the main phenomenon is school engagement of student athletes. And then after that, you will look into the antecedent or the factor variables. So in this case, the second theme or the second subsection of the review of related literature will be socio-demographic characteristics. So and then number 3 would be attitudes towards school engagement. So if you have more antecedents, then you have to finish all of the antecedents or the factors. And then that's the time you go to the subsection or the theme on the outcome. So in this case, the fourth subsection of the review of related literature is the psychological well-being. So within the sections, what type of literature should we collect and how do we make our discussions in each? So first we have to conceptualize, and define the variable, So this one, we define it to the main phenomenon and probably identify all of the factors and all of the outcomes that are connected to this school engagement and student athletes. And then, you go to social demographic characteristics. So for this one, you begin first with defining defining and conceptualizing the different chosen social demographic characteristics. And then after that, looking at the relationships between this one, as social demographic characteristics and school engagement. Alright? And then after that, you move to attitudes towards school engagement. So as always, you begin first by looking at literature that tries to define and conceptualize what attitudes towards school engagement is and how it has been studied, and then look for literature that try to establish the relationship between attitude towards school engagement and actual school engagements of student athletes. And then finally, for the last subsection, you look into the defining characteristics and the conceptualization of psychological well-being as seen in other studies, and then you look at studies that correlate school engagement and psychological well-being. So in that case, you already have a guidance, in terms of how you are going to search for the literature. So you have to look for the literature that are hopefully and favorably empirical in nature, and see how this different concepts are conceptualized or defined, and actually look for literature that attempted to correlate each and every one. It doesn't have to be the exact name of the variable. It could be a variable that has the same nature, so, and that's the reason why we call it a view of related literature. It doesn't have to be always the same name of the variable. Probably you see a variable whose name is student engagement, and that might be very similar to school engagement, so you may also include that in your study. Now, there are 3 types of sources of literature in the literature review, all right? And the best ones that you can get are primary sources, all right? So where do you get your primary sources? The best ones, you can get it from journal articles. The examples are the ones that I provided to you when we did our reporting for the first 2 weeks. The second one, we have technical reports, dissertations, and thesis, and probably you have access to the online repository of the LSU or other libraries elsewhere. You can also use them as primary resources, Next is you have your conference proceedings, meaning these are presentations and research conferences, and some of them have had published full papers, so you can also look at them. And then when you go up, this ladder, it becomes lesser and lesser useful, or lesser and lesser in terms of credibility, so these are this is what we expect you to have mostly in your RRL. So populate your research using this, and I think you're lucky, compared to my era when I was younger. When we do literature review, we have to actually go to the library and see printed journals. But this time, you have, you just go to scholar.google.com, and you already have a lot of literature that's available, that's online. So that's a good thing. All right. And then the second one, which shouldn't be your main source, but you can use them, but very, very little or sparingly, is secondary sources. So where do we get this? So we can get this to textbooks. So you have textbooks. Those are not primary sources, because textbooks are already made for education, not for research. But you can use them, encyclopedias, dictionaries, but my suggestion is you don't use them very much as you would use. I would say 80% of your literature review must come from journal articles, technical reports, dissertations, and theses. And handbooks, directories, these are this can hold good information for your study, but I wouldn't rely on this, and also indexes, abstracts. Abstracts are just very short, information on the research, so it doesn't give you a lot of insight, and therefore may not be as useful as a full journal article or a full dissertation. And then there are, of course, tertiary sources, what we call, and you never use them in a literature review. For example, Wikipedia. You don't cite Wikipedia, but you can use Wikipedia as a springboard to be able to find primary sources, because when you go to Wikipedia, it's like an encyclopedia but online. They have already citations, and they lead you to the main source. My suggestion is, if you can start with Wikipedia but you don't cite it, and then you go to the articles where Wikipedia is citing the information, and that's where you verify whether or not the information can be useful for you for the related literature that you are doing. So to repeat what I said, sources of the literature review, there should be principal reliance on research reports. So primary sources must be the main population of the papers that are found in the review of related review section. All right, and then You may also have research reviews, no, which are also considered primary sources, but they're not really empirical, because you will be able to see articles that are empirical in nature. Like in that specific research, they actually did a data gathering and they analyzed the data. So that's an empirical research. And if you remember, we also have what we call theoretical research, which are usually reviews, meaning they didn't really collect the data in that research project or in that article, but what they did was they did a lot of readings of previous research and made theoretical claims out of it. You may use this, but not as much as you would use the empirical papers. Probably you will be able to use reviews when you want to look into preliminary. What are the preliminary findings or preliminary established facts in a given phenomenon that can guide me? What theory will I use if I'm going to use a theory? Or what relationships do I want to establish? What variables do I want to test? That could be a springboard for it. But like I said, the population of studies that you put in your review of related literature must be populated by empirical research, And of course, please do not use blogs, no opinion articles, do not use anecdotal reports, interviews, case reports that are not really well explained. You do not cite or use Wikipedia, but again, Wikipedia can be your springboard towards more reliable information. All right? So, as I explained, many of the primary sources that you will be encountering while you are searching for the literature will come in the form of journal articles, like this. So, the typical organization of this research report is different from the usual thesis or a dissertation that has chapters. Because thesis and dissertations, they have 20,000, 50,000, 100,000 words. But for journal articles like this, the maximum would be 10,000 words, but usually the average is around 6,000. So you don't get to have a very thorough, detailed explanation in this. And there is a typical organization in the research reports, especially the empirical ones, the ones that really actually collected data and analyzed the data. So they have title, the title, and then they have the keywords. So you have the keywords here. The keywords are basically kind of tags, if you have para siyang hashtags. They're like hashtags in Twitter or in Facebook. It kinda places the paper in a specific topic. It's either a topic or a methodology, and this helps in being able to identify the paper when the paper is being searched. Alright, so the abstract is here. The abstract is around 150 to 250 words. The summary of the paper. Usually, this is the first that you read, and to be able to gauge whether or not you have to get into the study, to be able to see whether or not this study is something that you would use in your paper. Remember, general rule, you just don't put any paper in your review of related literature. The literature that you put in that section must only be the studies that are related, very closely related to the paper that you are currently doing. Do not, of course, quantity is very important, especially in quantitative studies. And I would expect quantity in terms of the number of studies, especially we are now living in a digital world wherein journal articles can be accessed easily, right? But also, very important is the quality of the papers that you're getting. Quality meaning, are you really getting the correct papers? Are you really getting the related papers? Are you not just confounding the discussion in the RRL just because you want to, put a lot of quantity in the paper? And we will have a few exercises on this while I evaluate your works and to really see whether or not you are correctly putting the correct review of related literature in that specific section. Alright, so if you finally decide within the abstract and you have access to the whole journal article, you can And then you will be met with the what we call usually the IMRAD format, no? So the IMRAD is introduction, methods, results, and discussion. And then of course you have references. The introduction is basically where you will find the researcher trying to argue or establish the significance of the paper, and then also presenting their short literature review, and also articulating the main study objective. And then after that, you have the method section that tells you what design and what methods the researcher used, what data did they collect, how many people were engaged in the study, what analytic tools were used, those kinds of things. And then you have the results section, wherein the researcher presents all of the numerical or narrative results of the study. And then they have the discussion section, wherein they relate their findings with the literature in the same field to see whether or not the findings are confirming or contesting the present literature. So this is the usual typical research organization. But remember that you don't really have to read everything. Especially as a novice researcher, I'm pretty sure that, like for example, the research articles that I provided to you, there are a lot of statistics there that you don't understand. And it's acceptable. And I think you don't have to dwell into the statistical tools, especially if you don't understand them. The more important is what the researcher of the article is saying in terms of the results, because eventually, after all the statistics have been done, they will articulate the results in a narrative way. They will articulate it as a paragraph. They did the statistics, so are they saying that there is a significant relationship between variable A and variable B? That is where you focus, and then what type of relationship is that? Is that positive or negative? And then probably if you still really don't understand, the talkies or the words that are being used, you have to have your dictionary near you, or you can search it up in Google. What do they mean when you say a negative relationship or a positive relationship, a significant relationship? That these variables that mediate the relationship between variable A and variable B. What does that mean? And how could I use this specific finding in my specific study if I could use that, if they are really related? So it's very important, And usually you will find this, you can probably find this area in the conclusion. So my suggestion is not for you to read from the start to the end. My suggestion is for you to read the abstract, see whether or not you are this study is something that belongs in your genre for your specific study. And if you consider it, yes, it is something that I could use, you go directly to the results and the discussion and the conclusion section and see whether or not the variables that you are interested in have relationships. And then when they do establish that yes, they are, you go to the methods and you ask them, so how did they come to these conclusions? What did they use? So that's the more smart way of doing the articles, and these articles were written for it to be consumed faster rather than you reading a whole thesis, reading a whole dissertation. You have to read smart. You have to read the parts that really mean more for the paper, for your specific research. All right. So there. Now, some papers that you find in the internet may have some paywall. When we say paywall, you only get to see the abstract, but for you to be able to see the full paper, you have to pay. Well, that's really sad because we cannot have access to it, and I wouldn't promote hacking to you to be able to access it, But you may always check with the DLSU library whether or not we have subscription to that specific publisher. Like for example, there are certain databases in EBSCO or ProQuest or JSTOR that the LSU or that our university has access to. So you may also check it out by looking into it. Later, And more and more nowadays, there's already what we call an open access, more and more open access journal. When we say open access journals, these are journals that are not hidden behind a paywall, so that you can freely peruse the whole paper without actually having to pay. So you don't just get to see the abstract, you get to see the whole thing, which is nice. But there is a growing number of open access. Some papers, they may have paywalls, but if you look into the research, you can actually email the researcher and ask them for a full paper, or probably you can look for the researcher in researchgate.com or academia. They might have posted their proofs there. When we say proofs, these are papers these are the manuscripts that have been accepted by the journal article but have not yet been turned into the journal article form. So the content is the same, but it's not like this beautifully layouted yet. It might be in a Microsoft Word with line numbers, but at least you get to still have the content. Or if you really cannot find a full paper about the research that you're very much interested about, you can actually email the corresponding author or some corresponding authors. When you say corresponding authors, if you have a list of authors and then they will identify a corresponding author, meaning when you want to communicate to the researchers in the study for that specific paper, you correspond to that author, and then you email them. Or some of them may actually have their own Twitter accounts, and their Twitter accounts are open. You can probably send a DM and then respectfully, tell them about your study, etc., etc. But this is only if they are allowing, being DM. But the more formal way of doing it is using an email. Right? If there's a paywall, if you cannot access the full paper, so that's another way of doing it. All right, so there. So steps in conducting literature review according to Creswell. 1, you begin by identifying what keywords do you want to use, for your study, because again, the keywords are very important for you to put in the search engine that will be able to point you to the right papers that might be of interest to you. So it will help you refine your search, in the academic library or college university, or in your specific in Google Scholar. These keywords may emerge in identifying a topic or may result from preliminary findings. All right, so and then as you go along, you will build more and more keywords. The keywords, usually the first ones, they're usually based from the variables in your study, so you can start looking into that. And then after listing down these keywords, go to the library or use your home computer and begin searching catalog for holdings like journals and books. So you can also use computerized databases like EBSCO, ProQuest, which we in the LSU or in our university has access to. Google Scholar, which is free for everyone, but Google Scholar will not be able to get you through a paywall when there's a paywall. But I'm pretty sure Google Scholar will show you if there are other avenues or versions that are free. So Google Scholar will give you that. And I think more and more researchers are presenting their data that are not in a paywall, so you can look at it. And then also other university repositories. So there are sports studies repositories of thesis and dissertation in the United States and other countries, and you may also make use of them, because they also make this public, full research, full dissertations and thesis. And then what you do is you initially try to locate about 50 reports. Yes, 50. And that is just the initial ones, because the 50 you have to filter that further. Reports of research in articles or books related to research on your topic. Skim this initial group of articles or chapters and duplicate those that are essential to your topic. So you can look at the abstract, you can look at the contents and see, this is something that I would use. And duplicate them and put them in another folder in your computer. Through this process, simply try to obtain a sense as to whether the article or chapter will be useful, for your study and understanding the literature. As much as possible, the recency must be 5 years, if feasible. There, in the sports studies and in your really specific fields, they are not very much. There are those topics that are not so heavily published in terms of number. So for those types of research, we allow up to 10 years. But the most ideal is it has to be published within the last 5 years because we are very much concerned with recency. And then as you identify the useful literature, begin by designing a literature map. So you have to do a conceptual map of, so what are this literature telling us? So how do we connect them with each other? Also begin to draft summaries of the most relevant articles. These summaries are combined into the final literature review that you are going to write for your proposal or full research study. Now, for novice researchers, this is what I propose and I ask them to do. I ask them to do a table of trying to look into, and then one row is one paper, and you're trying to see all the important components of that paper so that you can keep track of which areas you have already studied very profusely, and you can already see connections immediately in your related literature, because that's very important. In the review of related literature, you do not just present each study on their own, but you have to find connections between studies. Are they talking to each other? Meaning, are their findings relatable? Are their findings contradicting each other? Are their findings similar? Does the findings of study A explain study B? So you have to make them talk to each other in your write-up later. Now, I'm not expecting you to have a write-up immediately after a week because, usually related literature takes a lot of time. But it's important that you already have to document the literature and already try to create some sort of visual organization for the literatures that you include in the literature review so that you'll make a better sense of how the phenomenon and the story is evolving within and among these articles. And we'll try that with one article, right? So this one, you will be doing this, and I'm going to ask you to do this, not yet the full RRL section, but this is the first one that I need you to do because you need to learn about your current your phenomenon. So these are the columns. So this one I made this is something that I made and inspired by other teachers as well. So I will ask you to do to identify the title, the authors, and the year, the research problem and objective, phenomenon of the variable, design and population of the study, the instruments that are used, major findings of the study, gaps and limitations, and then the remarks. Okay, so let's try to do this for a specific study. So this one is the first article that I ever published, and we're going to use this, So we write first the title, and the author and the year it was published. So it's 2020. All right. So, and like I told you, you just have to look into the snapshots of the findings. You don't have to read everything, especially when you don't have the time to do so. So, let's try to do this. So I've written here already the title, the year, and the author, the year, and the title. So now we look for the research problem. So where is the research problem? In the text, usually you find it in the end of the introduction, or they could really tell it immediately in the study as a specific subsection. So what I looked into here is that it tried to examine the relationship among student involvement, mental health status, and quality of life of college students. So let's put that in the table. So here I wrote the research problem, right? The study aims to test the relationship among socio-demographic profiles, student engagement or involvement, mental health, quality of life of college students. And then let's move to the phenomena or the variables that are being measured in the study. So in this case, it's also still the socio-demographic profile. So let me just write that. Socio-demographic profile. We have the student engagement. involvement, I'm sorry, student involvement. We also have mental health, and we also have quality of life. And then in that study, it has multiple dimensions under mental health. So under mental health, it has psychological well-being, so psychological well-being, and also psychological distress. Of course, in your actual paper, because you have to type it, it has to be full words, no? But in this case, I have a very small space. That's why I am just using abbreviations. But in your actual paper, when you submit to me, you have to have these full words. And then next, let's identify the design and the population. So the research design is a non-experimental, cross-sectional, descriptive, correlational survey research. And then the sample size was 249. It's very important that you have to write where, no, what is the country or where is the place the study has been done. So here it was done in the Philippines, obviously, because that's where I live. All right, so let's put it here. So here you go. So the design is a quantitative, descriptive, cross-sectional, correlational study. And then the total number of samples, small letter N, is 249 college students in the Philippines. Right? So important that you have to write where the study was conducted as well. And then we'll also ask what were the instruments used by the study. So if it's quantitative, it is obviously a survey, and some of the survey forms are standardized or they have names. Okay. So according to the paper, the instruments, they have the demographic questionnaire, a sole student involvement questionnaire, which has 3 components, and the 3 components are involvement in campus activities, membership in university-based organization, and social interactions with school entities. And then we also have mental health inventory, which has 38 items, and the youth quality of life short form. So let's write that in our matrix. So here are the 4: demographic questionnaire, student involvement with 3 domains questionnaire, MHI 38, and youth quality of life scale. So you also have to figure out why were these the instruments used. So demographic questionnaire, because that's usually a part of a social science research. Student involvement with 3 domains. This one is to measure student involvement, right? For MHI 38, this was used to measure mental health, and youth quality of life scale was used to measure quality of life. And then you have to look into the major findings of the study, or you can probably add a column here. If you're interested, you can actually look at the stats that they use. But for the meantime, since you may not have a deep knowledge about stat yet, so let's go directly to the major findings of the paper. So as you can see here, you will have lots and lots of tables, and you might not be able to appreciate it immediately, especially if you do not have a deep knowledge of stat yet. But again, researchers will explain this textually through a narrative form, and this is how I explained it in my paper. So the research suggests that there's a relationship between involvement in organizations and depression, wherein involvement decreases depression, and then higher general positive affect and life satisfaction were higher among those who involved in school organizations and who were frequently relating with school entities. And then those who had lower levels of interactions with social entities displayed lower scores in quality of life. So those who had lower levels of interactions, they don't have high quality of life, and that mental health is related with youth quality of life. So we can put that now into the matrix. So I just wrote here codes, but in the actual matrix, you have to write the full paper. So there's a relationship between school organization membership and depression. There is a relationship between school interactions and school organization with positive affect and life satisfaction. There is a relationship between school interaction and quality of life, and mental health and quality of life. And then also, you have to look into the gaps and limitations. So what do you think were some of the characteristics in the paper that may influence the validity of the findings? Now, in most papers, the researcher will admit this, no? So it's kind of a cautionary disclaimer that a researcher usually provides, so that hey, these are my findings, but my study isn't perfect, and these are the things that did not make it perfect, and probably if you want to do this study again, you may want to address these imperfections. So in the study that I made, the limitations, it was cross-sectional, meaning I only took the data in one period of time, so I cannot really establish causal relationships. I can only establish covariance between the variables. And then secondly, there's a limited number of participants, because in Quanti 249, not it's fairly okay, it's fairly big, but it's better if you go higher and you don't just get it in one school. So in my case, I only got it in one school, so that was the limitation of the study. So let us put that in our matrix. So there you go. Here's the gaps and limits. Again, in the matrix, it has to be narrative or bullets. It's just that we have a limited space in this slide, so I cannot really put everything. So low sample size and one school only. Right. So what are the remarks are basically, what do these things that you have found for this specific study, how can this help you in your current study? So probably, because this paper only included one school, probably we will do more schools for present study. Alright? And also, you have to relate it with the variables that you are testing. So let's say you're doing this hypothetical research. This will be able to help you analyze this relationship, right? Because we were telling in that paper that school organizations and interactions with school entities have a relationship with psychological well-being, specifically life satisfaction and positive affect. So that is what you will put in that matrix in the remarks, because this is going to be what it's going to contribute to your current study and literature review. So it can be used for the relationship between school engagement and psychological well-being. Alright? So there. Again, should be full narrative. It's just that I have limited space. And then you will do that for each study that you take into your related before you start writing. And then in here, you'll be able to see immediately, okay, so what papers should go together? What papers should talk to each other? Right? So this gives you a visual situation of the relationships. So this is an example of Creswell's work on his own conceptual framework. So after probably he did the matrix that I did earlier, he made a visual connection among the findings of the study. And you can actually do it this way. You can also create a conceptual framework. So it's going to be easier for you to write. Alright? And then it's very important that for the studies that you have chosen to be a part, or candidates to be a part of the literature review sections, you have to summarize the study. So mention the problem being addressed by the article or book, identify the central theme of the study, and state the major conclusions related to the theme. So, that's very important that you have to that's how you put the study into the related literature as you connect it with other literature review. And I think when you put that in the matrix that I showed you earlier, it will give you a better sense of how you will be able to summarize it better, and also it will decrease the chances of you getting to plagiarize stuff, because you're now really summarizing it based on how you understand and the useful information from that study that can be applied. Because usually students, what they would do, they would put the abstract into the review of related section, the RRL section, and they just paraphrase, but they don't really marry that specific study with the other studies. They don't establish connections. So you have to establish connections. Your RRL should tell a story. Not, of course, not a storytelling time that's creative. When I say story, there should be a narrative. There should be something that you are arguing, while you traverse the study or the RRL. So this is an example of how we can summarize studies as given by Creswell. So you can pause the video here and try to study how they did, the a specific study summary to be put in the RRL. So you can see here, immediately the objective of the study. There you go. That's the objective. And then you have here also a short description of the methodologies, who were included, right? Who were taken, what type of data was collected, right? Etc. And where was this done? And then also you can see here, that there's already the results, so the different terms of their professional needs, and also recommendations of the study. And probably in the study that this Creswell was being embedded in, it's important that this is correlated with other studies as well. So remember, you have to make the studies talk to each other, and you can use English transition words like moreover, in connection to, in the same vein, similar to the studies of, because you have to make them talk to each other. You have to make them connect through the way you write them. And then after summarizing the literature, you have to write them together, assemble the literature now, and structure it thematically and organizing it by important concepts. And I already told you how to organize the related literature review. And then you have to synthesize. So the last section always of a literature review is a synthesis. Usually it's a one page, a few paragraphs, only up to one page or less. And basically the synthesis is just telling us the summary of all the insights that were gained from all the literature review. But more importantly, you have to identify the research gap that you found. Again, what is the research gap? The research gap is what is not yet known, or some data that is still inconsistent, or there are not many findings for us to be confident about the established truths about the study, about that area of research. And that's the reason why you have to do your own study about it. You have to connect your objective or your research problem with the gap that is seen in the literature. So here is how you write. Now, there's a summary of research findings per theme in the literature review. Compare and contrast findings. Focus on the areas that have inconsistent findings. And you have to present the research or the data gap. It can be conceptual data gap, like for example, there are many variables that were measured this way, but they haven't been connected with this variable that you're interested in. And that may be what you want to do for your study. Could be a methodological data gap. Probably you've seen too many qualitative research and probably you have to do a quantitative research now. Or you've seen a lot of quantitative research but none of them have good sample size, or probably the survey needed better, that you needed to have a better survey form. So that's a methodological gap. Or cultural gap, like for example, a lot of the research that you've seen were done in Western countries, not very much in Asian countries, more so in the Philippines, and therefore there are studies needed to be done in the Philippines. And then you have to situate your study in the body of literature. Which of the identified gaps you showed will your study address? And this is now very connected to the research problem, right? Because again, remember that the research problem has to be refined by the literature. Of course, it comes from your interest. This is the phenomenon that I want to look in. These are the variables that I want to connect them with. That's the initial idea that you have. But when you get to your literature review, you will discover that, oh, maybe there are already answers to what I am trying to test. And if there are already answers, there's no point for me to pursue that study, and probably I have to look for other variables that have not been fully established yet. And probably you have to refine the research problem, you have to refine your conceptual schema or framework from the initial one to a better one, which is not yet fully explored in the study. And then in the synthesis paper, you will this is not yet what is found in the current body of literature. And I think because this is very important, at the same time not yet fully studied in the literature that I have amassed, and maybe then I will address it by doing this specific study and then state briefly the research problem of your study. So how do we articulate that? So you can again pause the video here and see how it was done in other studies. For this reason, the meaning of war and peace has been explored extensively by social scientists. So, Ziller is telling us, yes, there are so many studies about war and peace. So, Cooper is there, Alvik, Russell, Svankarova, Halversrud, but there's really not much studies on how veteran past wars react to vivid scenes of a new war. So, this is what now he's saying, yes, this is where my study is going to be situating itself with. This is the new insight that my study is going to be providing. Yes, there's a lot of studies about war and peace, but how about veterans and how they perceive new wars? This is what my study is going to be talking about, and that's going to be your argument as well when you do the synthesis. Or another would be deficiency of literature. Despite an increased interest in micropolitics, it is surprising that so little empirical research has actually been conducted in the topic, especially from the perspective of subordinates. So what Blaise is arguing here is that there's so many interests in this specific area, but there's not much empirical studies on this, and therefore that is what I'm going to do. I'm going to do a micropolitics-based research. So that is your final argument in the literature review under the synthesis section. What are the gap? What is the current literature telling you at the moment? What has the literature been very clear about? And then you tell them and you argue, yes, the literature has been clear about these arguments. However, seems to be some area that needs to be filled in because the arguments and the findings for this is still very, very little or inconsistent or not really fully explored. And therefore, this is what this current study, or this is what the present study is going to explore, which the objective is blah blah blah, so and so forth. So in this video, you were able to learn about how to do and how to write a literature review. Alright, and this is going to be a very daunting task, and I really wish you the best for it. And we will have a lot of consultations and evaluations for this until we perfect this. And I hope that this is not the first time you've seen this, because you've probably had this in your high school lessons. And I hope that this will be able to improve your skills further.